last week I started us off with a story from my high school years, so I figured why not start off with a story from my college years this week. It's one of my memorable ones, and I think it was about sophomore year of college that I had had this one theology course. And in the syllabus it said that we were going to have this one paper due at the end of the semester. So at the beginning of the semester I knew I had this final term paper due, and so like a good student I waited until the day that it was due. The day that it was due at like 4:30 in the afternoon, and I went to work on writing it that morning. And it's not just like a paper, it's like a research paper. So I'm having to go to the school library and I'm sitting there frenzied trying to research this and research that and look into all of the things that I had to look into for these all these many different questions. And so I'm just trying to jot it down as quickly as I can on that computer in there, and I am waxing eloquent about all these things that I have no idea. I'm getting it all done, and I'm watching, as you can imagine, that like clock tick away, and I'm thinking I might get this done in time, and I'm hurried and frenzied, and all of a sudden I start getting the motion. The mouse is no longer a mouse. You know what I'm talking about, right? When all of a sudden it starts and then it goes blue screen. And some of y'all are so young, you don't know that there was a day before there was such a thing as autosave. So in that moment, after hours of working, it was all gone. Like, it was all gone. Suddenly the computer was crashed, and it's amazing how many things can be felt and experienced even just physically in such a short amount of time. I remember that sinking feeling in my stomach. Did this just happen? Is this really happening? The blood rushing to my extremities, like physically, I can feel the blood rushing to my extremities of, oh no, what now? What am I gonna do? And my brain is scouring in like microseconds its archives of knowledge that I have stored up in my brain for what solution is there to totally fix this and make it like it never happened, because this can't be happening and this needs to be like it didn't happen. And you know what I'm talking about? Like, you ever been there before? It was an entirely unenjoyable situation, but actually, honestly, it was an entirely unenjoyable situation added onto an unenjoyable situation, because the initial unenjoyable situation was the sudden loss of all of my hours of work, right? But then the lines got blurry because all the stress and then the fear and the helplessness that came afterwards were also unenjoyable, and they were kind of like the aftershocks from the original earthquake. The fear of what this would mean for my grade, what this would mean for my future, the helplessness of losing something with no sense of how I could ever or would ever get it back, slowly realizing that I would never, in fact, get it back. And fortunately for me, this was a paper due for a class. And trust me, in that moment, it wasn't necessarily small potatoes, as the saying goes. Like, in that moment, it felt like a big deal, but this is something that I was able to move past fairly quickly. Just so you know, I passed the class. I graduated with my degree, even though I didn't get that paper handed in. And also, my computers now do a fairly great job of saving my projects as I work on them. And just to be safe, I've also avoided college libraries entirely, just, to be careful and safe. See, I felt all of the fear and hopelessness somewhat intensely, but by and large, briefly. But not all pain is quite so convenient in that way. See, this is one of those personal examples that I'm willing to share with you. I'm totally okay sharing with you with a bit of a grin on my face. But I've had fear and hopelessness come like waves after other pains in my life that I only talk through with my closest friends. Those aftershocks hit far differently than when files get deleted. Those pains are much more significant. And you know what I mean too. Like, we're not alone. Trauma of the fall in the Garden of Eden, for instance, left Adam and Eve saying, we feel afraid. We're afraid. Gideon, when his people were under attack by the Philistines and he had to do work in that kind of hostile environment, he would hide and do work that needed to be done outside. He would do it inside because he was afraid. Or you think of Peter, when Jesus is getting arrested, who was afraid and helpless. Or even when the women eventually came to the tomb on Resurrection Sunday and they're going to treat Jesus' dead body only to find out that he's risen from the dead, there's still fear and helplessness that comes with that. I said last week that it's good that we process our pain and let God meet us in it and speak to us through it. And since this pain of fear and helplessness is sort of an accompaniment pain to the actual initial hurt, the initial trauma, or the initial heartbreak, I think we should process this too. See what God has to show us when it comes to fear and helplessness and grief, and talk about it. In fact, I want to talk about the harsh realities of fear and helplessness. For starters, like I already said, the deeper the pain, the deeper the sense of fear and helplessness that likely come with it. It's kind of tailored a bit to the situation and the pain itself, but it's pretty much guaranteed. For instance, just think of some of the fears that can come up with a health issue. The fear of being a burden to others. The fear of what I won't be able to do now because of this. Am I ever going to be healthy again? What if it's even worse than they think it is right now? And as you see, we sometimes pose them as questions when really they're fears that we're experiencing. Or like think of the loss of a dream and the fear of maybe what is my life going to look like without this dream now actually coming about in my life? Or maybe you have the fear of ever dreaming or hoping again, or the fear of what others are going to think of you now that it didn't work out. I could give examples for days on so many different categories and all the different fears and ways it could hit you and I. But when I sat in the library computer lab chair that day, I had a deluge of different things that were hitting me all at once. And we often talk about grief in like watery terms, like flood and deluge and all that. But it fits to say that fear and helplessness come in like a flood, just like a flash flood. And though fear and helplessness aren't exactly the same, they aren't, they're different, they operate together in the grief process. That's why we're talking about them together today. Because we experience a current of fears flooding into our life. And then we start to assess what we can do to stop it all, right? We can protest. I just don't want this to be, we can bargain, do everything we can think to do to make whatever it is not true. Let's just fix it. And as the reality continues to settle in, we start to experience then the helplessness of realizing that we don't have a thing that we maybe can do that can undo what we're going through. We can sometimes see this whole process fleshed out in really obvious ways and pick up on it easily if it's really literal and right in front of us. Like, I don't know, you ever watch any fail videos? I have a guilty pleasure where I actually like watching fail videos. The videos of people, like usually they have either somebody's recording something like the America's Funniest Home Videos and something silly happens, or it's like a security camera that catches. Like, one of my favorite ones for this example is somebody walking with a wedding cake and falls right in front of the bride and groom. Like they're carrying it from one table to another and it just falls, and you kind of watch them as they're like realizing what's happening and they're trying to do everything they can to stop it from happening. But sometimes our life comes crashing down in the same way, where you just kind of see it happening, and sometimes it's much less obvious that it's crashing down. And so we might not even see the fear, helpless dynamic as obvious in our lives, but it's there. And it's kind of crazy and odd that with each layer of loss that you and I experience in our life, it seems like life is that much more paper thin. Like it's just that much more sensitive and fragile. We start realizing just how fragile our life is, or how fragile our way of life is. We all got to see that in different ways, but we all got to see that kind of craziness come in like the last 18 months. And how it shows us how fragile life can be, or our way of life. And I personally don't like feeling helpless. Like, I'm not sure if you do. You don't, right? Like nobody likes feeling helpless. In fact, just the other night, my wife Madeline gave me another one of her gentle and loving pep talks that I had absolutely no desire to hear in that moment, but it was true. I was frenzied in the kitchen getting ready for a big dinner we were having with some friends. And I was aware that I was struggling with dinner. But I was also aware that as much as people were offering to help me and all that, there really wasn't much that those hands of theirs that they were offering to help me with could do without me having to explain everything to them. And it was just easier if I just did it. And in the kind of hurried pace, I was starting to rush so much, I actually even like gave my finger a little nick with the knife that I was using to cut something. And Madeline gives me this moment where she says, hey, take a breath. It's going to be all right. Just breathe, calm down. Because she knew, wisely, that there are different ways of dealing with fear and helplessness. So even in that moment, as I'm like frustrated and fear and dealing with some fear and helplessness, and I can go crazy and kind of get angry or kind of get worked up, there are some ways we deal with it that are more productive than others. And this leads me to one of the main things that I want you to understand today is simply this. Things don't turn out well if you don't know where to turn. When it comes to fear and helplessness, which you and I are going to always, like this is not something that some of us, we all will deal with this when it comes to deep sorrow, deep pain, and on our road to good grief. But hear me loud and clear. Things don't turn out well if you don't know where to turn. See, it's a sad and dangerous thing when we feel stuck in life. Psychologists were able to see this in all new dimensions when they electrically shocked different dogs. I know it's kind of weird, right? Kind of crazy that psychologists are shocking dogs with electric currents and all that. But it was for science, so it's all good. See, in 1967, psychologists Martin Seligman and Stephen Mayer, they ran an experiment, and a bunch of experiments, where they administered electric shocks to some dogs who were in an enclosed space. And after enough shocks to these dogs without any way out, the dogs eventually just got used to it. And even when they suddenly had a way, they'd lowered the wall or something like that, or they'd given the dogs a way to get out and get away from the electric shocks, the dogs didn't. They just stayed and they suffered. They then replicated this experiment with people, but instead of electric shocks, they used like loud sounds and bright lights, which is nice that they were willing to change it up for people. But then after doing all this study, they came up with this term, learned helplessness. See, in moments of pain, when we're afraid and we feel like we have nowhere to turn, we can begin to see things differently. It's maybe in those moments we learn helplessness and we maybe start to lose our faith. But for Paul and Silas, it was in that moment of being stuck and having nowhere to go that they actually decided to exercise their faith. And that's how they responded to their fear and helplessness. See, they realized their help came from the Lord. That's where they were going to turn. They were Paul and Silas were some of the first ministry leaders of the first century church. Highly influential and therefore highly targeted by their enemies. The people who were persecuting Christians were happy to go after them. And it was so bad, the persecution that was going on, that what ends up happening in this story is they have this girl who's following them around who's demon possessed. She's tormented by demons that are plaguing her, but also allowing her to predict the future. And so she's basically a child trafficked victim where her owners are profiting from her demon possession. Paul and Silas knew that God wanted her free, and so they prayed for her and set her free from those demons that were bothering her. But the guys who had been profiting off of her possession were ticked. So they went ahead and made sure that Paul and Silas were beaten, and then not just beaten up, but they had them jailed even. So they're imprisoned. And so they're dealing with pain, grief, fear, and helplessness as they're in a prison cell going, what is going to happen to us? What's next? We don't know. And what is God doing in this? And they were trapped, literally. And this could be a moment for that learned helplessness to come up. But in Acts 16:25, what we instead see is about midnight, Paul and Silas were praying and were singing hymns to God. And the prisoners were listening to them, it says. Now listen, I don't think they were glossing over or pretending like everything was okay. I don't think that's what's happening in this moment, is that they're just like, oh, there's nothing wrong, let's just sing some happy songs. It just says they're singing hymns. I think it's actually way more profound than glossing over. In fact, I think they were calling out to the God who sees them. Remember, we talked about that last week with Hagar. They were calling out for the God who sees them in their grief. I think they were worshiping and by singing songs that would grow their faith and crying out to God for help. Literally, it could have been a song like Psalm 121, where it says, I lift up my eyes to the hills. From where does my help come from? My help comes from the Lord, who made heaven and earth. Or it could have been Psalm 147:3 that says, He heals the brokenhearted and binds up their wounds, because they were wounded. They were beaten up. Or it could have been Psalm 94, 16 and 19, where it says, "Who rises up for me against the wicked? Who stands up for me against evildoers? If the Lord had not been my help, my soul would soon have lived in the land of silence. When I thought my foot slips, your steadfast love, O Lord, held me up. When the cares of my heart are many, your consolations cheer my soul." I want you to know that we don't always sing the faith-filled songs that we sing as a church or as people in our private times of worship with the Lord because we're full of faith. That we don't always sing songs of incredible faith because we're full of it already. Sometimes it's because we know we want to be. We are lifting up our eyes to the hills of our lives to cry out to God for help. We're saying, "God, this is who you are. Will you come help me?" We're recognizing that when the cares of our hearts are many, that God's consolations really do cheer our soul. And honestly, it's only God that can help us then, when it really comes to it. Only His perfect love can cast out the fears as they rage against us in that moment. When fear and helplessness are coming through because we're realizing that there's nothing that we can do to undo what got us here, what we're going through. And it's in that moment sometimes that God meets us in profound ways. But it's also in that moment that God empathizes with us. Hebrews 4 says, "For we do not have a high priest," speaking of Jesus, "who is unable to sympathize with our weaknesses, but one who in every respect has been tempted as we are, yet without sin. Let us then with confidence draw near to the throne of grace, that we may receive mercy and find grace to help in time of need." And I want you to pay attention to that word help, because we're talking about helplessness here, right? Did you hear the invitation that the writer of Hebrews is giving us? Let's draw near to the throne of grace to receive mercy and to find grace to help us in our time of need. See, if we look primarily to others, or if we start looking to ourselves for our help, it's just way too limited to give us the help that we actually really need. But at God's throne of grace, there's sufficient enough mercy and sufficient enough grace to adequately meet our significant needs. That's why Paul and Silas sung out and stormed the throne of God that day or that night in that prison cell. They cried out to the only help that could come to them in that trapped moment, because things don't turn out well if you don't know where to turn. But God invites us to turn to Him with our fears and with our feelings of helplessness. Tells us not only to approach Him, but to approach Him with confidence, right? It's what we just read. This isn't a just do this one thing and everything will reverse kind of solution. This is the best way to get through what you're going through kind of solution. So I want to look at, because I want this series to be very practical, I want to look at what it practically looks like to turn towards God. If fear and helplessness are going to come in when we deal with extreme pain and sorrow and hurt, what does it look like to then turn to God, if that's the only place that we really can and should turn to find healing in that? What does it look like? Well, I think it starts with acknowledge your fears. What am I afraid of in this moment? What are some of the things that I'm thinking, that I'm feeling? What am I afraid of? And acknowledge the sense of helplessness. See, it actually, maybe it's counterintuitive, I guess, but it actually helps with disarming them to acknowledge them. You got to name them, and sometimes we think, if I just ignore them. No. Talk about it. I'm afraid that I'm unlovable because of this thing that just happened. I'm afraid that I'm never going to get better or healthy, or I'm afraid that I'm going to lose more people that I love. Maybe I should just stop loving people. Whatever it is that you're dealing with, address it. See, David did this all the time in his Psalms of Lament. When you read through the Psalms, he's always addressing, this is what I'm going through. So I want you to pick up on something that's going on here. It's okay to acknowledge the ugly. We're not invited to live in denial or close our eyes. We're actually invited to open them wider. See, we're looking at what's going on in our problem, but we're not just focusing on the pain right in front of us. And that's why prayer and worship are so powerful. You remember that's what Paul and Silas did in that prison cell, right? They didn't deny the harsh realities of their abuse and their lonely prison cell, but they also didn't forget that they served a God who sees the depth of every cell, every atom, and who had kept them alive through that ordeal, who had allowed them to see a bit of what Christ had suffered for them in that situation, who gave them someone else to sit beside them in their struggle in that cell, and who also gave them voices that they could use to sing. They saw all of this. So you may notice that we're kind of bleeding into another practical and powerful tool that we can use to deal with our fear and our helplessness in those moments, and that's gratitude. Again, fine lines here, and I need you to hear me out. It's not good if we feel like we can't or just don't address the thing that is striking fear or causing a sense of helplessness. But at the same time, gratitude, like for all of the help that we have in Jesus, is a critical part of the process of grieving towards healing. See, because real gratitude doesn't deny our problems, it just gives them a greater context. I feel like that's important enough. I'm just going to repeat it one more time. Real gratitude doesn't deny our problems, it just gives them a greater context. It's crazy how this works. In around World War II time frame, actually it was during the World War II, a guy named Henry Beecher of the Harvard Medical School studied soldiers in Italy who had been wounded in battle. And he was astonished when he started observing that only 1 in 3 soldiers with severe wounds would ask for morphine. Only 1 in 3. Many told him in those moments when he's asking them if they want it, that they didn't really feel much pain or that it was pretty minor if they felt it at all. And this was like totally in contrast to the 4 out of 5 civilian people who would have wounds that were very similar in seriousness and all that, and they were begging for morphine or some kind of painkiller. So 1 out of 3 versus 4 out of 5. And the morphine, just so you know, primarily works in those moments, it's magic, by reducing a patient's fear and anxiety towards what their body is going through. Apparently, Beecher found out that was already being taken care of for the soldiers as they were lying on their recovery beds thinking of the significance of maybe what their wound meant in their fight against that other enemy and all that. Or perhaps the relief that they felt that they were no longer on the battle lines. The fear was kind of dealt with a little bit with the gratefulness that it wasn't at least fatal and they were alive and wounded and not dead. Those kinds of things were going through their minds. And so it was helping them to deal with their fear in a way that literally affected the way their body felt. Beecher concluded in that moment then that like pain's intensity actually has more than just physical factors that play into it. So for us, fostering a healthy sense of gratitude that doesn't deny the rough realities but doesn't deny the good ones either is critical to helping us in our pain. I've known people who, on a practical level, choose to journal and write down those kinds of things that they're grateful for, the things that they would otherwise maybe be overlooking in the midst of their pain. I know people who write songs. Instead of journaling, they write songs and just kind of write it all out to God, or just in their own kind of just write it out to whoever would ever read it or listen to it. Or some who memorize scripture that's encouraging in those moments. All different kinds of things, but all things that make much of Jesus and make much of the things that he's done for us. And sometimes it's good just to tell somebody to their face, just to meet up with somebody and tell them what you're going through, good, bad, and ugly. And that gets me to another very practical thing that you can do to help turn towards God when life takes a turn towards fear and helplessness. And that's turn towards his people. You know, he calls it his body, and in many ways we, as the church, are functioning as Jesus' body here on the earth. And God gave us his church, just so you know, not for just church services, but for exponential impact in our lives. That means impact exponentially on serving others, serving our world, an exponential impact on spiritual growth and growing, but also an exponential impact on how we handle life's hardest times and how we cope and grow through that. You see, another science experiment was done with these monkeys in a stress chamber. All these poor animals, tell you what. But anyway, these monkeys were just kind of put in this chamber and then bombarded with sounds and lights, and they tested their stress levels, and obviously their stress levels were through the roof. And then they went ahead and they put another monkey in with the one that was by himself, and they did the same experiment. Everything's the same. The levels of the sounds and the lights are the same, but the stress levels in the monkey were less when there was another monkey in there with him. And it just kind of goes to show that the right people in your corner may not remove your problems, but they'll kind of, in a way, help you carry them. Especially as like humans and not monkeys, as followers of Jesus, when we gather together, when we work together, there's no telling what we can do when it comes to carrying each other's burdens. Lastly, I would just encourage you that a real practical thing that you and I can do when we're facing those feelings of fear and helplessness is just write down a list. If you are willing to get some pen and paper, or maybe your phone or laptop or something like that, write down a list of what you can versus what you can't control. Because fear drives us towards focusing on what we can't control in that moment. This is out of my control, and that's out of my control. And because it's a kind of a universal primal response to suffering, fear is, it's also one of the single greatest enemies of recovery. And so it's really good for us to look and go, okay, well, what can I do? What's going to help me deal with my fear and disarm my fear by acknowledging the control that I do have in this situation? Just think of this. 1 Peter 4:19 says, "Therefore, let those who suffer according to God's will entrust their souls to a faithful Creator while doing good." I think that kind of points to what I'm saying here, as far as like the idea is like, I can't do a lot. I'm going to have to entrust my soul to a faithful Creator. It's just, there's things that are out of my control, but while doing good. So while doing whatever is in my control, to go ahead and do the good that God has called me to do. I'm going to trust God with my soul, and I'm going to do the good that I'm able to. And that's easy to say, I know. Tough to do, I know, but incredibly powerful when we do. See, in those moments, we're looking and going, God, I don't know what's going on. I'm afraid of this, and afraid of this and this. I need your help. I'm looking to you. Show up and help me according to your will. Help me, because I can't do this on my own. I've heard it before, you probably have as well, said that when God is all you have, you realize God is all you need. And that's probably oversimplified. I mean, really, it's true, but even God acknowledges we have other things that pull on us and that are needs in different ways. And yet I can't imagine anyone else realizing the reality of the statement and the sentiment of it more than Job. I mean, Job's story, which we kind of talked a little bit about last week, we'll talk more about in the series, is one where it's just crazy all that he lost. And yet after he loses everything, one of the first things we kind of get a picture of Job's response is Job 1:20, when he arose and he tore his robe and he shaved his head and he fell on the ground and then worshiped. And he said, "Naked I came from my mother's womb, and naked shall I return. The Lord gave, and the Lord has taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord." I want you to notice that Job is grieving. Like, he's tearing his robe, and by shaving his head, those are cultural signs of mourning. He is grieving. He is not pretending like this is okay. You need to catch that part. He is not just, oh, God's good all the time, God's good. He's mourning, he's grieving. And yet at the same time, he takes his fears and his helplessness and he just turns it over to God. God, you brought me into this world and you'll take me out. I didn't start with anything, and at the end of the day, you're sovereign for whatever I do have or don't have. While I don't understand, Job is kind of saying here, I'll still bless you. I'll still turn towards you. See, I think helplessness might be one of the most natural reactions to deep sorrow. Doesn't that make sense to you? Like, I think helplessness might be one of the most instinctive things we would do when we're dealing with really big pain. And so I think it's okay that we experience it, but as those in Christ, we have a better option than just staying in it. Just because it's natural doesn't mean it's desirable and should be embraced, right? Like, it's in that moment when we've had our lives get shaken that we actually need a firm foundation. So when things are shaking us, we need that firm foundation. I think that the initial pain, whatever it was or is for you or for me, those initial pains are the epicenter of the earthquake. And then the fear and helplessness are the aftershocks. And if you've ever experienced in your life extreme trauma or despair, you know how that fear and helplessness aftershocks can come and go so randomly. Like, you just don't expect it, and all of a sudden something gets said or done, and like the fear and helplessness come right back up with such intensity. And in those moments, where are we going to turn? What are we going to do? How are we going to be able to handle that? What's our solution going to be? It's in those moments when we turn towards the one who can calm the storms of our soul, who can speak peace right to the pain that you're dealing with, who can at the very least look at us and say, I understand. And actually be telling the truth when they say that, unlike some of our friends who maybe wanted to say, oh, I understand what you're going through. But God, who can look at us and say it truthfully, who can empathize with our pain, and who can offer us a grace and a mercy to sustain us through the pain that no one or nothing else can offer us. Like I said before, I agree with the psalmist when they say, I lift up my eyes to the hills. From where does my help come from? My help comes from the Lord, who made heaven and earth. Anywhere else that we look, we'll be looking to something that was created rather than the Creator. And suffering kind of calls us back to the source, doesn't it? So let's turn to the source of life and to find that help even when life feels like it's crashing in. Maybe especially when life feels like it's crashing in. That's when we need to lean in all the more. Cry out, worship, ask Him to meet us in it. Because fear and helplessness makes sense to feel, but God also wants to meet us in those feelings so that we don't have to stay there. And we can find Him helping us through that. Hey, a real quick afterthought after just finishing recording that I want to make sure that it's very clear, because sometimes what we misunderstand when these kind of moments happen of turn to God, you hear your pastor say, and you think, all right, well, I guess I just need to turn to God, just turn to God. I want to make sure you understand that sometimes the way that we turn to God and obey what He then says to us or is doing is sometimes it's turning to community, like the church, like I said, as a practical example. And that's a way that we can turn to God, or sometimes it means turning to professional help. And I want to make sure that you know, like when you're dealing with trauma especially, or some of these more serious wounds, it is not faithless or disobedient to turn to a Christian counselor, to turn to a doctor to see if there's maybe a medical situation going on. It really can actually be one of God's graces to us to help us, to use the good graces of what He's given us in the world around us. But let me just encourage you as well. You can do those things without turning to God, and that won't be ultimately what's helpful for you. But again, hear me loud and clear that yes, sometimes in turning to God, we also are turned by God towards things here on earth that He's given us that'll help us to deal with the fear and to deal with the helplessness that we can feel with, to deal with the pain that we can be going through when we're grieving. And that's a good thing.